Hi, this is Molly Barnes, 88.5 KCSN Art News. I am delighted to have as my guest tonight the fabulous Robert Williams. Robert is a fine painter and sculptor who has been termed outsider artist because of his Renaissance renderings of the dregs, the detritus of our society. The rot, the wrecking balls, the sexy women, the cars, the graffiti, the drugs, and rock and roll. Hi, Robert.
Hi, Molly. Thanks for letting me be on your show again. I appreciate it.
Well, I really love it. I mean, you're my favorite guest.
Oh, come on now. You say that every week.
Well, if I were going to compare you to somebody, I would compare you to Jerry Lee Lewis. And the reason for that is because I think you look a little like Jerry Lee Lewis. You've maintained your position in the art world for so many years, and everybody looks up to you.
Well, that's sweet. I appreciate you saying that.
How'd you get started?
How'd I get started?
Yeah.
Well, I always had a propensity for art, even as a child. And as I grew older and got into my teens and did work and whatnot, I discovered my easiest path in life was to stick with art.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in New Mexico and in the Deep South, Alabama, Florida, Georgia.
Did you have a good relationship with your dad?
No, not really.
He was a military man, as I recall.
Man, right, and I was a budding bohemian.
You use the word bohemian all the time. What does that mean?
Well, a bohemian, it's an old romantic term that means someone that doesn't fit in society, but is not necessarily a criminal, but someone that's got a certain amount of talent and creativity.
How is that different from the word, another word that we all use a lot, illustrator?
Well, you're getting into a semantic situation here using the term illustrator, because in the 20s, an illustrator used to be called a practical artist.
Yeah, exactly.
It used to be called a practical artist. And I think late 30s, the word illustrator came along, commercial artist, and in the 50s and 60s, illustrator became a very derogatory term in the fine arts world. The commercial art world, it was still a very proud term, but the fine arts world tried to reject representational art, and by doing that, they used the term illustrator, meaning someone that was facile but didn't have that romantic and sensitive flair of soul that an expressionistic painter would have that could just slop paint on.
What would you call the kind of work you do? You've used the term conceptual realism, and you've said that it's very close to Dada.
Well, I've been known for a long time as the lowbrow artist, the father of lowbrow art.
What does that mean?
Well, the thing about lowbrow, if you call yourself a lowbrow artist, that means it's about as low as you can go, so everything's positive from that point on. You can only come up. And being a lowbrow artist, you have total freedom. You can do as you please. You're not academically restricted because you're already pigeonholed as being problematic.
So how would you put yourself? I mean, you talk about yourself as an outsider artist. Who are some of the other outsider artists?
I didn't say I was an outsider artist. I'm a disenfranchised outlaw artist. I'm an underground artist.
Okay, I said you're an outsider.
That term outsider keeps coming back. An outsider artist is someone without art training. I've got a formal art education.
Where'd you go to art school?
I went to art school at Los Angeles City College in Chenards.
Really?
Yeah.
Were other artists that you've remained close to in that group?
No, because I did representational art. This was in the early 60s when all my compatriots and peer group were all abstract expressionists, so I was referred to as the illustrator.
How did you get into the comic book art world?
Well, I always loved to draw, and my earliest influences were comic books and one-sheet B-movies and hot rod art and things like that. So I had this questionable form of interest. So I landed a job with Ed Big Daddy Roth, a car customizer, and I did his ads and shirt designs and whatnot, and I was in hog heaven because I could use the wildest imagination, see.
How in the world did you get with Big Daddy Roth?
Well,
you remember who used to write about him was Tom, what's his name? The wonderful man that wrote the candy-colored, Tom Wolfe.
Tom Wolfe, yeah. Well, Ed knew Tom Wolfe very well. I met Tom Wolfe through Ed.
Okay, how'd you find Ed?
Well, Ed was, I was working for Ed right in the middle of the psychedelic era, and Ed was for any program. Ed prized artists that had a certain amount of draftsmanship, a certain amount of skill, and an extremely wild imagination. Things had to be flipped out, and I fill that bill. See. And while I was working for Ed Roth, I met some of the psychedelic poster artists from San Francisco, Mouse and Rick Griffin and whatnot. And a new comic book had just come out from Robert Crumb called Zap Comics. And through hook and crook, I got my way into Zap Comics in 67, 68, 69. So then I really had a free rein to really express myself as loose and wild and gratuitous as you could imagine.
But how did you get involved? Didn't you become the head of Zap Comics?
No, you're thinking of Juxtapose. I was the founder of Juxtapose magazine. No. So there were 7 artists that owned Zap Comics. Crumb founded it, and the 7 artists that participated in it are all joint owners in Zap Comics.
Did you see Crumb's show recently at the Hammer Museum?
No, I was in New York having my show.
Okay, let's hear about your show. Matt Gleason from Coagula magazine has called you the most historically significant artist of the past 40 years. How do you feel about that?
Well, that's very kind, but I think you're kind of cramping my style on humility here. I can't,
Okay, go on.
Well, I was honored that, I always admired Matt Gleason. Now, you have to understand, I'm sure your listeners know who Matt Gleason is, but Matt Gleason is the art critic with the guts,
Exactly.
He stepped on everybody's feet, Now, I admire that, and I really think that's great, but that wouldn't be exactly the thing about art is should be no rules in art, and art should be any program and free. So there's no good and bad in art. So to sit in judgment over one nincompoop over another wouldn't kind of goes against my grain, even though there's some that I find distasteful and I'm not sympathetic with it. It's very wrong to stand in judgment of people and their art.